All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is financial dimension corruption, understanding and avoiding. My name is Erin, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this session through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. This session is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. When you join this event, your name, email address, and/or phone number may be viewable by session participants in the attendee list. By joining, you are agreeing to this experience. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions during the presentation with some time at the end for verbal Q&A. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Eric Pegors, Senior R&D Solution Architect. Eric, over to you to kick us off today.
Thank you, Erin, and welcome everyone. As Erin said, my name is Eric Pegors, Fast Track Solution Architect, and my background is that before I joined the Solution Architect team, I was on the General Ledger team, starting with AX 2009 and worked on the dimension changes that came in AX 2012, which is the basis for what we have today. So I was a consumer of dimensions for a long time, and now I'm on the Solution Architect team. So let's get started. Our agenda today is we're going to get some background on dimensions so that we can put the guidance in context. We're going to talk about what dimension corruption looks like and understand it, and then we're going to talk about avoiding it. So the first thing is the dimension background. So a financial dimension is a category used for similar values, such as a department, a cost center, or an item group. The dimension values are the individual values for a dimension. So that could include business unit 1, cost center 20, item group 100. Those are values, and on the screen you can see all the values for the business unit dimension in demo data. And we tend to use dimension and dimension values pretty interchangeably. Most of the time it's pretty clear which one you mean. Sometimes we might say one or the other, but it's common to use them interchangeably, and that's fine. So the 2 most common types of dimension usage are default dimensions, which is the set of dimension values that are associated with a non-ledger account. The name default dimension refers to the surrogate foreign key that is stored as a reference in other tables. These are entered in the dimension entry control, which is typically a default financial dimensions tab. And these are stored on master records such as customers, items, vendors, or stored on documents such as sales orders, sales order lines, and purchase orders. And this is a picture of the dimension entry control, where you can see it has 1 value for business unit and 1 value for item group, and the others are blank. A ledger dimension, as contrasted to a default dimension, is a main account and a set of dimension values. The ledger dimension name also refers to the surrogate foreign key that is stored as a reference in other tables. Ledger dimensions are entered in the segmented entry control, and sometimes I will refer to them as a dimension combination. These are typically stored on transactions, such as in the general ledger and the general journal for ledger account types. And this is a picture of the dimension or the segmented entry control on a general journal for, so it's a main account and the set of dimensions, like I mentioned. So let's talk about what the dimension corruption typically looks like. And the 2 main types of corruption that we see are copying default dimensions or ledger dimensions across companies, and or I guess deleting or updating the dimension data, the internal sort of dimension data in the database that is used to support all the dimension functionality. Dimension data is company specific, which is why copying it across companies is considered corruption. The dimension data will often reference company data, and it also references a chart of accounts through a main accounts. And at the end of the day, well, let me not get ahead of myself. Typically, company-specific corruption is caused by copying the default dimensions or ledger dimensions across companies. The record sharing frameworks, such as cross-company data sharing, are blocked from doing this, but we have seen it still happening with customizations and with other ways. For reference, the general journal entity does not support multiple companies or intercompany. Now, the general journal form does support both of those, but the entity is one company only. And chart of accounts corruption is very similar. Two companies can, if they have different chart of accounts, that's the exact same pattern. They don't have to have different chart of accounts, in which case the main account is not company specific, or it's the same in both companies, but it's not guaranteed to be different across companies, but it can be, I guess, is the simple way to say it. My company-specific corruption example was from, I think, around a couple years ago, maybe 18 months. This is a customer that I worked with. They had 100 companies about, and they had around 5,000 vendors per company, and they were using cross-company data sharing to keep the vendors in sync in all the companies, same vendors in every company. And there was a customization made to copy the default dimensions from the vendor table to the vendors in other companies. Again, because the standard cross-company data sharing does not allow sharing of the default dimension. And those default dimensions were heavily used in purchasing transactions. And through dimension defaulting, they go from the vendor table to the purchasing transactions and all the way into the general ledger. And the total impact for this customer was over 1 million records that were corrupted in the transactions, starting with the vend table through the purchasing transactions and into the general ledger. So let's take a little deeper view of the dimension data to get a healthy understanding of how it works. So I'm using this general journal example. They're in two different companies, so it is going to be cross-company. The first one is main account 401-100 and item group audio in USMF. And the second one is the same values, but in the company DEMF. So if I put the queries here, and then I put the results. The queries will be in the handout or the PDF that goes with the TechTalk, so you can look at them and sort of adapt them to an example for yourself. So I did a query to find those two records, and the things that I want to point out is that excuse me. Sorry, I was trying to get my mouse pointer to work here. There it is. So the companies here, DEMF, and you can see that the ledger dimension for DEMF is 4502, and for USMF is 3752. And the point we're trying to make here is that these two are company specific, and we're going to follow them down a little ways to understand why they're company specific. So the next table that we're going to look at, that was LEDGERJOURNALTRANS, the journal lines table. The next table we're going to look at is dimension attribute value combination, which is sort of the top level ledger dimension table. There's the query. I took the 4502 and the 3752 ledger dimensions from LEDGERJOURNALTRANS, and I put them in here. And you can see that the display values, they're identical. We also, in this table, we know what account structure they're associated with, and we know what main account they're associated with. And it's the same main account because those two companies both use the same chart of accounts. So the main account is literally the same account. Now, if we use the dimension attribute level value view, which is a view that is something like what I would call ledger dimension details, we, on the exact same two values, the 4502 and the 3752, we're going to start to see some more interesting things. First of all, we don't have two ledger dimensions anymore. We have 4 ledger dimension details. Each ledger dimension had 2 sections, or had 2 segments, so that's a total of 4. And we can see that 2 of them are for one and 2 of them are for the other. Again, the display values are identical. The dimension attribute is the next thing we're going to dig into just a bit. And then these are the attribute value rec ID. We'll cover those in a minute. So the first thing is we can see that for the dimension attributes, there's 2 of them, 4583 and 1189. And this is the dimension attribute is the financial dimension. So the business unit, cost center, department, main account is nothing more than a somewhat special financial dimension. And then we have item group. So here's the names of the dimension attributes. And interestingly, right, we know exactly what table these are stored in, and we know the field that contains the dimension value. Okay. Now I'm going back to the ledger dimension details for a second, and I want to focus on this attribute value rec ID, which we can see here that we have 3 values. We have 4132, 5403, and 5406. So if we go into the dimension attribute value, which I would call a dimension value reference. So these are the building blocks of the dimensions. Each individual string that you see in a dimension has a record in this table. So I can see here that I've got, excuse me. I've got those dimension attributes, which tells me that this top one is a main account and these 2 are item groups. It's got the rec ID of that record. So this is the main account rec ID, and these are the 2 item group rec IDs. You probably recognize the suspended. You can suspend a dimension value, and this is where that's stored. These are not suspended. And then we have sort of a duplication of the string value. Those are typically, the duplications are typically done for performance reasons, to simplify queries and things like that behind the scenes. So those are things that just, you use the APIs and it does the right thing, and it does them in a way that this was added. This was not originally there, for example. So, but it's to help the performance. So anyway, let's talk about 1430 and 1439, the 2 item groups. So now we're in the item group table, 1430, 1439, and we can see that, yeah, they're the same. They're both audio, but they're in different companies, and that is the difference. And putting that ledger dimension in the wrong company is the definition of cross-company corruption. The examples of this deep dive were intended to show that the data is more complex than it might appear. I kept the example as simple as possible because I wanted everybody to be able to understand it, and I didn't want to take a real long time presenting it. The example scratches the surface of dimension data complexity, and the point of showing it is also to give a healthy respect for the complexity. And we had a question yesterday about, it's so complicated. There's a lot of rec IDs and ref rec IDs, and those that complexity is there to support all the different features from dimensions that we use and almost take for granted. And there's not any more complexity there than is necessary to support those features. And again, we've done extra work to help to keep the features, but improve the performance and things like that. So as a person on the GL team, I never looked at dimension data beyond what we just looked at. If I had a bigger problem than that, I would talk to the dimension team about what's the right API, or we need an API or a technique or whatever it might be to use the dimensions, consume them in the proper way. So we have a metaphor for dimensions and changing dimension data, trying to change it. If we create a sales order for customer 1 in company USMF and we post it, great. Then we find out after it's been posted that that sales order should have been for customer 2 in a different company, DEMF. We would never go into the database and try to change the customer record to fix the problem, right? We would void the original and post the new one. And those relationships are very similar to the key relationships used in the dimension data, and you should not go into the database and try to fix them because it's just not the right approach and it will end up causing problems. As I mentioned, the whole dimension design supports a lot of useful and powerful functionality. The implementation details are super important, and the corruption is sometimes not found until much later. Things seem okay, but then when you post to the transaction, which triggers some extra validation, or when you update your dimension set balances, which could be a day or two later, or when you run the year-end close, which could be a year later, or a consolidation, then we're trying to consume the extra features from those dimensions, and things start not working. And then that's when we get into trouble and we notice it. And by that time, it's too late to undo it or do a database recovery or something like that. So we need to be good users of the dimension data. I mentioned before that a good amount, or that there was some duplication in the data, and we saw it in some of those examples. And the good amount of the power, right? It's a balance between duplication and for performance and not having things duplicated, because when you have duplication, if something is allowed to be changed, then you have to go update the duplicates, that's exactly what happens during things like dimension activation. We do that, or I think it would actually, yeah, and account structure activation as well. Anyway, so the bottom line for deleting and updating dimension data, which should never be done, is that the dimension data is immutable. That means that once it's created, we don't update it, and we certainly never delete it. And yet deleting dimension data is the number one cause of corruption that we see. Just going in, typically this would involve going into the database because the UI does not allow you to delete the things, because that's part of the design. Dimension data is anything in tables that names begin with dimension attribute. And in general, most dimension corruption is, like I said, is caused by deleting data, and it's done because it doesn't look right. You see those two dimension attribute value combinations, they look exactly the same, so you automatically think they shouldn't be there. And that's, we have a strong desire to keep gold data clean for go lives and things like that. But truthfully, corruption is fixed by creating the correct default dimensions and ledger dimensions and updating the records to reference them. Even when we're fixing data, we don't delete or update dimension data. In fact, when we fix those 1 million records in the company-specific example I mentioned, we did not delete or update any dimension attribute records. We updated the default dimensions on a bunch of vendor tables. records, in the purchasing transactions, and in the general ledger to point to the correct default dimensions in ledger dimensions. And if the incorrect default dimensions, they may have been correct in a different company, or they may not have, and they're just left there because they're not going to hurt anything, and the system knows when to reuse them and when to not reuse them. So we didn't have to do anything else. So let's talk a little bit more about avoiding corruption in your dimensions. The first thing is to avoiding dimension corruption is to not ignore messages such on the forms or the UI that say you can't delete something because a dimension exists. The very common one is financial dimensions. A financial dimension gets created and it's decided that it's not needed. There's no way to delete them, and you shouldn't delete it. You can rename it to put it at the bottom of the list. You can, as long as it's not included on any account structures, it won't show up in the default dimensions control. And, most users will never know it's there. But trying to delete it is a lot more harmful than just ignoring it. And, I think it's a good learning thing to be sure before you actually create them. But it happens, but they're fairly harmless. Even if they get created and you don't want to use them, they're much more harmless than trying to delete them. So don't delete or update data in the dimension tables to get around those messages. If you find yourself going to the database, especially in a gold or in the sandbox before go live, you should really question that, because that can be very dangerous, depending on what you're doing. But in general, you should use the UI and the data management framework to do all the things you need to do. In general, the sources from the deletes and updates, most come from SQL statements that were executed when you had SQL access, either before go live in gold, or people will add a custom form that allows them to directly execute SQL in production. And that is not a good practice anyway, but it's especially not a good practice for dimension data. It should not be done. And if you're executing SQL in production for other things, I really question that as well. There is a new feature to upload a custom X++ job or runnable class that is designed for fixing data, and not in dimensions, but for general purpose, assuming you understand the problem and it's limited and there's a bunch of controls on it. You have to have 2 users. Somebody has to approve the script, and it shows you the database log of what is going to be done. So it's pretty useful. It's quite new. So you can look into that for other things, but I really encourage to not run SQL in production or before go live in your sandboxes. It should be avoided in general, but especially for dimensions. We also see a copy of the systable browser form. The standard one had the ability to do deletes and updates removed quite a while ago. So we still see copies of it where people go in and use it to delete records. It's no better than executing SQL in production, in my view. You can also do customizations written in X++. Those are less common, but not uncommon. One thing, the amount of corruption we've got, we'll talk about the impact on everyone in a minute, but we're still consistently seeing corruption due to deleted records. So since for about a little over a year, database triggers have been rolled out that prevent deletes and updates on the dimension tables that are most often corrupted. I want to say there's around 10, and 2 that we talked about today, dimension attribute value and dimension attribute value combination, are definitely on the list. They're high on the list. I think there was one more, and they're in the top 3. And the other one, truthfully, I did not. I know I recognize the name, but I don't know what it does. The view hides a few of the things for me, and I've never dug that deep, even when I was on the GL team. Anyway, the triggers continue to be rolled out to productions and will soon be rolled out to sandboxes as well. I think they're already starting to roll out to sandboxes just to try to get a handle on the corruption, because the data in most of these tables can't be recovered, and the engineering cost to reset the data is very high, and it keeps the engineers from working on legitimate bugs and new features and all that kinds of stuff. One final note is that I think the triggers and maybe other things we will communicate with customers on that we noticed an attempt to do corruption or something that is causing corruption, and don't ignore those communications. Follow up on the changes to the root cause. If you have a customization that's not doing the right thing, the customization I heard of was, I think it was like just deleting an item group or something when it was used as a dimension, something like that. So anyway, the point is to listen to the communication and, open a case if you have questions or need help understanding it. We're happy to help, because it's a lot better than the alternative. And the repairing of dimension data is always a SEV-B support case. And as I mentioned before, in way too many cases, there's not a lot that can be done to recover, and it's also time consuming for everybody. So, I mean, we get it, but there's not really that much we can do about it either. So, one other possibility for dimension corruption is to have an XDS policy for dimension data. This is not as common, but XDS policies are not supported for dimension data. On Fast Track, we know that we ask questions about when anybody has an XDS policy, because they're well known for unintended consequences as well, things being restricted that you really didn't want restricted. But an XDS policy on dimension data will result in some of the dimension data not being written due to a lack of rights or permissions. And the resulting dimension data is corrupt and will cause issues. So the bottom line is that you cannot use an XDS policy for dimension data. Typically, what we see in Fast Track is if there's a desire to do some limiting, such as a user can only see data that has their department in it. We do a form by form customization, and those will a lot of times utilize the dimension APIs to do things in the most performant way, but the designs will vary depending on the form and a few other things. So, but again, no XDS policies, please. So the fleet management data does contain a branch, location, and rental location dimensions. And we occasionally see these dimensions used in a gold demo or development environment. But then the problem is that moving the gold data to the sandbox fails, because the fleet management data is demo data, and the code and all that is not allowed on sandbox or production environments. It's on demo and development environments, but it's not allowed, and installing the deployable package will fail. So make sure that you're not sort of reusing those dimensions from fleet management. Okay, so I wanted to quick talk about what we did instead for that company-specific corruption solution or problem that I mentioned. What was the solution? And we changed it to use copy into legal entity to copy just the default dimensions from the one company to the other company, to all the other companies. And so basically it was a account number and the default dimension string and nothing else. So the string gets exported from the source company, or the default dimension will get exported from the source company in that integrating applications format, which is a string. And then it gets imported into the target company, and the import converts the string back to a default dimension, and the default dimension will be correct for that legal entity. So that avoids the problem of, it doesn't copy the default dimension, the 64-bit integer. It sort of converts the source default dimension into a string, and then it converts that string into the target default dimension. We included a filter on the job so that it would only run for vendors that were modified in the last week. We didn't want to miss any, but if we didn't do it every day or whatever, but we didn't want to include all 5,000 vendors every time. It would run for a very long time. So that was our compromise. And then we also included disabling a support case to disable lock escalation on the vendor table, because we were doing a lot of vendor table updates, and by disabling lock escalation, we were able to run companies in threads and not result in deadlocks in the database updating that one field. So this solution is what they're still using to, when they have a new vendor, to get default dimensions on that vendor, or if they change the default dimensions on their master company, to get it down to the other 99 companies. And it's working fine. So the summary, I just picked the top 3. If you come out of here with nothing, do not delete or modify dimension data. Those are the dimension attribute tables. Do not copy default dimensions or ledger dimensions across companies. And do not use an XDS policy with dimension data. So I have 2 things that were from yesterday's session. I'm gonna 2 questions I'm gonna re-answer here for everybody, because they were great questions. And then I'll take some questions. I think the Q&A people, Matthew and Jason, will let me know if there's any out there. But the first one, I covered it a little bit during the presentation. It was very common about deleting you create a financial dimension, then you don't want it anymore. And what you have to do is you can rename it, and you can take it out of your account structures, and then the impact will be very minimal, but there isn't a way to delete them, and you shouldn't try to do it in the database, which is right, we just talked about. The other thing was about a question about consolidation and getting the legal entity into the entries that get generated in a consolidation. So it'd be the source legal entity. So you have a dimension for where this data came from. And I think that the consolidation default, or the consolidation dimension tab, is one places where you can see all the dimensions. So you would see that one you didn't want to potentially, but you can create a legal entity dimension, and any of the dimensions though in there, the options are like none. So you just drop that dimension during the consolidation if you don't need it. The detail, or to pick one value to consolidate it into, department 1, 2, 3, all get consolidated into department 1. But one of the options is company accounts, and it'll put in the company account of the source company and automatically. So this is one of those dimension features that we talked about that's specifically there. And it probably makes most sense to actually have a legal entity dimension and use that. But the consolidation has the functionality to get the company in there sort of automatically if you choose the right option. And I did it with item group, it works. But, of course, we would probably recommend having it on a legal entity dimension, which again is sort of an unused one, or it's used in just a few cases, and it kind of reinforces the idea that having an extra dimension or 2 is not harmful to almost most of the users, and it's helpful to some. Um, were there any questions that you wanted me to follow up on? Yeah.
Thank you, Eric. We have one question. This is regarding public sector. The question is regarding ledger values on billing codes. Does it cause corruption if we change the values versus creating a new version?
That I don't know the answer to that question, but we can follow up on it. My email is on the was on the first slide, but I'll say that I would expect that if there's the capability to change it in the UI, then it's probably fine. Because like I mentioned, you can rename a financial dimension after it's been created, whether you want to just put it at the bottom of your list or mark it as do not use or something. That that's the idea there. But if it's supported, you would be able to do it on the form or the page.
This is a general question. We might need to follow up on this after the fact, but the general question is there any documentation on how financial dimension data is structured to help with reporting?
That's a great question. There is probably some, but I suspect there probably could be more. So that would be something that we could follow up on. I think that one of our parts on this is to have better documentation. So on the, like I mentioned, there's APIs. We were just working with a customer who was trying to doing the restricting by department that I mentioned. And if you use the right APIs to add those queries on the forms, it uses those duplicated values to make it perform better, as an example. So let's get that information, or they can reach out to me.
Okay, thank you. We have quite a few new questions coming in. One of the latest is, does similar guidance exist regarding not deleting apply to dimension values, even if they're never being used?
Yeah, sure. So I think the answer is yes, but in general, the forms will control whether you can delete it or not. And if the form says no, then don't do it, right? Don't go into the database to do it. But we have a sort of an easy way, right? We can check for those dimension attribute values, those building blocks, to see if that already exists. We don't want to break it because it's got the rec ID. So we would you can't delete it and then re-add it. That's not how rec IDs work. So again, it's immutable. Yeah, you shouldn't delete it.
But we could mention there's the suspended button to
absolutely. That's right. Thank you. You can suspend it. You can suspend it in just one company, I believe, or in all but one. So yeah, there's other options. I didn't see a suspend option on the dimension, or a disable it or something, but I will check into that, because that might be a better solution. But for sure, dimension values do have that capability. Yes.
Another question from the audience: is there any issue or impact to using balancing financial dimensions?
In the terms of corruption, no. And in terms of general functionality and performance, not really. I implemented that in 2012, actually, and it's generally applied right before the general ledger gets created. Balancing dimensions. I'm sorry. I did help with that as well. I was thinking of fixed dimensions. No, it's not, but I think that it does generate more combinations. So, but I wouldn't expect the number of combinations to be significant enough to change the performance of it, as long as you're not using degenerate dimensions. If it's a lot of reuse, a lot of the same dimension values being used over and over, that stuff is all optimized very well. If you've got new dimension values every day because it's based on something volatile, that's a separate problem, and it sort of flows downstream. It makes everything harder, including things like balancing dimensions and into the consolidation in your enclosed. So in a normal situation, I would not expect it to, be a material thing. But I also wouldn't use it if it's not necessary.
And there are some questions about financial dimensions that are degenerate dimensions, and the moderators are responding to that in the chat box.
Yeah, and we could certainly do another tech talk on degenerate dimensions if there was interest in that. So that would be great. I think, we are trying. We have plans to improve that. But at the end of the day, it's I guess there's levels of it too. So, but it's a great topic, actually.
Nearly all the questions have been answered directly in the chat. One question, however, has just come in. Could you suggest a solution to merge several dimensions into one? My clients have 31 financial dimensions, and I would like to recommend them to streamline this into a much smaller number.
Well, I mean, I think that I would agree, but we typically see dimensions like that when there's a bunch of legal entities that are quite independent, right? There's 10 legal entities, each with 3 dimensions, and there you have 30 that are completely independent. As far as merging, I think you've just got to, it comes down to making a business decision about what's important and what's not, and then making a cutoff, and you would change your account structures. And I'm working with a customer who's doing this, and one of the problems is that they have a degenerate dimension. They have 112 million rows in their dimension attribute value combination. Those don't all go into the general ledger, but a lot of them do. And yeah, it's a business decision first. And then actually, I think after that, and after you get over that decision process, the technical parts of it aren't that hard. Although I will warn that activating account structures when you have that many combinations can take a little time.
Okay, thank you, Eric.
Well, thank you.
I believe we've gone through all of the chat, so it's either been answered online or in the chat itself.
Sure.
Jason,
and
Jason, if there's anything I missed, please jump in.
Nope, all good.
Okay. Well, thank you, Matthew and Jason, and thank you everyone for your attention and listening. Again, if you have something, my email is on one of the first 2 slides when it comes out. And otherwise, I'm sorry, I got a couple of links. The one at the bottom here is the link to talk about the triggers coming out that I mentioned about that prevent deleting and updating. The other one is just the top of the financial dimension documentation. Otherwise, back to you, Erin. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you, Eric. Thank you, everyone. I've posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We would love to get your feedback on today's session and hear what you'd like to see in future events. We thank you in advance for your participation in taking that survey for us. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. You'll receive an email letting you know when that is live for on-demand viewing. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters and, of course, to the audience for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, wherever you may be.